The room behind the wall. In the town hall of Bruges, there's a staircase that ends at a blank wall. Not a locked door, not a boarded-up doorway you can still make out the outline of. Just a wall, plastered, painted the same color as everything around it, indistinguishable from the rest of the building unless you know to look for it. The only reason anyone knows a room exists on the other side is that the exterior windows don't match the interior floor plan. Walk around the building and count the windows on that level. Walk inside and count the rooms. The numbers don't agree. There's a gap, roughly 4 meters wide, that the building's own blueprints simply don't account for. Nobody in the current municipal government can tell you what's back there. The city archives have no record of a room being closed off. No renovation order, no permit, no complaint, nothing. Just a wall where the geometry of the building says there shouldn't be one. This isn't a unique story. It's an oddly common one. Once you start looking for it, and understanding why requires stepping back from any single building and looking at what these buildings were actually for, several centuries ago, before they became the kind of places tourists walk through without really seeing. Part 1. The room was the regulator. Before anything resembling a modern bank existed, European towns still needed somewhere for economic life to actually happen. Somewhere prices got set, disputes got settled, and everyone could trust that a pound of wool sold in one shop was the same as a pound of wool sold in another. That trust didn't come from law alone. It came from architecture. Almost every substantial European town, from the 12th century onward, built some version of the same institution, a public hall attached to, or built directly into, its seat of civic government. Depending on the country, you'd call it a cloth hall, a weigh house, a staple hall, a bourse. Functionally, they were nearly identical everywhere. A large open room, often on the ground floor, containing the town's official set of weights and measures, physical objects, usually bronze or iron, kept under some form of communal custody, against which any merchant could check any transaction. If you thought you'd been shorted on a bolt of cloth or a sack of grain, you didn't sue. You walked into the weigh house and checked it against the standard, in front of witnesses, and the dispute usually ended right there. This is easy to underestimate as a piece of economic history, because it sounds almost quaint next to modern financial regulation. But it was, in its own blunt way, remarkably effective. A merchant who wanted to cheat a customer had to do it knowing that the tools to catch him were sitting in a public room a 5-minute walk away, accessible to anyone. That single fact, that the standard was public, physical, and checkable, did more to keep prices honest than any guild oath or municipal ordinance layered on top of it. The weigh house in the Flemish town of Ghent is one of the better documented examples. Municipal records from the 14th century describe an official whose entire job was maintaining the calibration of the public standards and settling disputes on the spot when a merchant or customer requested a check. The records don't describe this as some kind of ceremonial function. They describe it as one of the busiest jobs in the town administration, because people actually used it, constantly, for exactly the purpose it was built for. Part 2. When the room stopped being useful to the people who ran it. The trouble, from the point of view of anyone trying to accumulate financial advantage in a town like this, is that a functioning public weigh house is a genuinely inconvenient thing to operate next to. It's very hard to quietly manipulate prices, hoard information about supply, or extend credit on favorable terms to one merchant and not another, when every transaction in town can, in principle, be checked against a public standard by anyone who walks in the door. Starting roughly in the 16th century, as private banking families and merchant consortia in cities like Antwerp, Amsterdam, and Genoa began accumulating the kind of capital that let them operate more like modern financial institutions, Historians have noted a curious architectural pattern. These public halls didn't get torn down. They didn't get formally abolished either. Abolishing a centuries-old civic institution by decree tends to draw exactly the kind of public attention that nobody trying to quietly consolidate financial control actually wants. What happened instead, city after city, was slower and much harder to notice happening in real time. The public rooms got smaller. A way house that once occupied the entire ground floor of a civic building would, over the course of 2 or 3 generations of renovations, find its usable space shrinking. A storage room added here, an office for a private banking concern added there, each change small enough on its own to look like ordinary maintenance, until the room that once served the whole town's merchant class had been reduced to a closet with a single official standard. Nobody quite remembered how to consult properly. Architectural historians studying town halls in the Low Countries have a term for tracking this specific kind of change. They call it functional contraction, and it shows up with remarkable consistency across unrelated cities that had no obvious reason to coordinate with one another. A public hall recorded as occupying, say, 60% of a building's ground floor in a 15th century survey will show up in an 18th century survey of the same building occupying perhaps 15%, with the difference converted almost always into private offices, storage, or administrative space controlled by whichever institution had gained the most financial influence in that particular town by that particular century. Part 3. Ceiling. Instead of removing what makes this pattern architecturally distinctive and what makes it worth an entire video rather than a footnote, is that the space wasn't usually destroyed. It was sealed, and the distinction matters more than it might seem to at first. Tearing out a public institution invites a question. Why did you do that, and who approved it? Sealing a room, gradually, through a sequence of individually unremarkable renovations, invites no question at all, because at no point does anyone experience a single dramatic before and after. Nobody wakes up one day to find the way house gone. They experience, across a lifetime, a room that used to be a little more accessible than it is now, then a little less than that, then eventually inaccessible entirely, by which point the person who might have complained about the original change has usually died, and the next generation has no memory of the room ever functioning any differently than it currently does. There's a well-documented case in the town hall of Leiden in the Netherlands, where a restoration project in the 1960s uncovered exactly this kind of sequence. Behind a 19th century storage room, restorers found an older brick partition. Behind that partition, an even older doorway, bricked shut, leading to a chamber that matched, almost exactly, the dimensions of a public measuring room described in a 16th century civic inventory. 3 separate layers of concealment built up one renovation at a time, each one small enough that no single generation of Leiden's citizens would have experienced it as anything more dramatic than routine building maintenance. The restorers found no explanation in any surviving municipal record for why the original chamber had been closed off in the first place. Just the physical fact of it, preserved in the brickwork itself, the only record of a decision nobody had apparently felt the need to write down. Part 4. What replaced the public standard? Here's the part of this story that tends to get skipped over, because it's less visually dramatic than a bricked-up doorway, but it's arguably the more important half. Once a town's public measuring standard became difficult or impossible to consult, something had to fill the gap, because merchants still needed some agreed-upon reference for what a pound or a yard actually meant. And what filled that gap, in city after city, wasn't a new public standard. It was a private one, held by whichever banking house or merchant guild had accumulated enough standing in the town to have its own weights treated as authoritative by default. This shift is documented, somewhat dryly, in the commercial correspondence of several major trading families from the period, letters that casually reference checking a shipment against the house standard rather than the town's, with no comment at all on the fact that this represented a fairly significant transfer of a public function into private hands. Nobody writing these letters seems to have experienced the change as remarkable. That, more than anything, is the real substance of the story. Not a conspiracy with a plan and a villain, but an entire economic function migrating quietly from a public institution to a private one generation at a time, with nobody along the way feeling like they were the one making the decisive move. Economic historians looking at price stability across European trading cities during this period have found something that lines up uncomfortably well with this architectural pattern. Price disputes, and the volatility that comes with unresolved ones, tend to increase in the towns and decades where the public measuring infrastructure was contracting fastest. Part 5. What's still there? Here's what makes this more than a historical curiosity. In the vast majority of documented cases, nobody ever demolished the original chambers. They're still there, inside buildings that are still standing, still in daily use as town halls, museums, and municipal offices, holding meetings and school tours and civic ceremonies in rooms built directly on top of or immediately adjacent to spaces that haven't been entered in a documented capacity for 200 years or more. That's the detail that tends to stick with people once they've heard this story. It's not really about the past. The walls are still standing right now. The unexplained gap in the floor plan of the Bruges Town Hall isn't a historical footnote in a book somewhere. It's a physical fact about a building where actual government business is conducted today by people who, as far as anyone can tell, have simply never had a reason to ask what's on the other side of that particular wall. Whether what's back there is meaningful in any practical sense today is genuinely unclear, and probably, in most cases, it isn't. A bricked-up closet is usually just a bricked-up closet, whatever its original purpose. But the pattern itself, repeated across enough cities to be more than coincidence, tells you something worth sitting with, that institutions rarely announce the moment they stop being accountable to the public they were built to serve. They just quietly stop maintaining the room where that accountability used to happen, and wait for enough time to pass that nobody thinks to ask why the floor plan doesn't quite add up.